Good evening. Hope everyone is doing well and you had a beautiful Purim and as well a beautiful Shabbos to follow. Tonight we're going to be learning Maseches Pesachim, Daf Tzadi Zayin, and as well Daf Tzadi Ches Amud Aleph up to the Mishnah. Relatively quick moving Gemaras, does require focus, but otherwise relatively quick moving. On Wednesday night, which was the last time we learned together, we had stopped 2/3 of the way down on Tzadi Vav Amud Beis at the word Esvei. And that's about 6 lines up from the Y lines. I'm just going to go back up a few more lines to create a better context. About halfway down on Tzadi Vav Amud Beis at the two dots that begins with the words Achar Shchitas HaPesach Yavi Shlamim. Here what we're going to see is a comment of Rava. Rava gives a qualification to our Mishnah, and we're not exactly sure whether or not his qualification applies to the Seifa, as the Gemara will first present, or if it applies to the Resha. We're unsure, and the Gemara is going to analyze both of them. And in fact, when we shift Rava's understanding, what we think is Rava's understanding of the Mishnah from the Seifa to the Resha, it also changes what Rava says, just to make things a little bit more nuanced. So let's get started halfway down Tzadi Vav Amud Beis, and we're right at the two dots there. Achar Shchitas HaPesach Yavi Shlamim. This was a line that Rabbi Akiva said in our Mishnah, that if a lost animal was found after its replacement was karev, after its tmura was shechted on Yud Daled Nisan, then that extra animal, then the initial animal that was lost and now found is brought as a shlamim. So there, says the Gemara, opening up halfway down Tzadi Vav Amud Beis, says Amar Rava. This is approach number 1 of Rava. Rava says, Lo shanu. When do we say that this is true? Ela shenimtza achar shchita v'himir bo achar shchita. That's only true if the lost animal was found after the shchita of its replacement had taken place. Aval nimsa kodem shchita, but if the lost animal was found prior to the shchita of its replacement, v'himir bo achar shchita, then tmuras mikoch dusha dechuya kaasa v'lo kreva. So Rava's comment to the Seifa of our Mishnah works as follows. Our Mishnah says, at the end of our Mishnah, at 1/3 of the way down, it says that if it's achar shchitas HaPesach, if the animal was already karev, if its replacement animal was already shechted, so then it becomes a shlamim. So says Rava, that's not true always. It's only true if the initial animal was found only after the shechita. That's when you bring a shlamim. So Abaye has a problem with this. Esvei Abaye. Abaye says, I have a brisa that has an implication, Rava, that your pshat in the Mishnah is wrong. Your qualification, your lo shanu ella, your qualification of our Mishnah is incorrect. What does the brisa say? Esvei Abaye, 2/3 of the way down, Tzadi Vav Amud Beis. Im kesev, the pasuk says im kesev. What do those words mean? Im kesev, matam olomar im kesev, the rabos tmuras HaPesach, achar HaPesach shekarv shlamim. Sounds a lot like our qualification of Rav in our Mishnah, that it is to include in the world of shlamim the tmuras HaPesach achar HaPesach shekarva shlamim. Okay, we have to see what this means. Hey chidami, what was that case? Was it in line with Rava's qualification of finding the initially lost animal before, or maybe finding that animal after the actual hakrava? Let's see, Echidami, 3 lines before the wide lines. Ilema, if you want to say shenimtza achar shchita, v'himir bo achar shchita, pshita. If you want to say that you found both of them after the actual animal was karev, so the animal was lost before the shchita, and we didn't find it until its replacement had already been shechted, that case is obvious. Lama likra. I don't need a pasuk to teach me that. That case is pasha, that it's not going to be b'shlamim. Ella, says the Gemara, Ella lav, it must be shenimtza kodem shchita. It must be that it was after we found the lost animal before the shchita took place. V'himir bo achar shchita, and any substitutions, any tmuras that were made after the korban was brought. And if that's the case, it doesn't fit with the shita of Rava. It might be Rabba. I'm going to use Rava for the Gemara, but throughout the Gemara, this Rava may be Rabba, Rabba may be Rava. Very hard to tell from the Gemara, other than to say that Abaye and Rava typically do argue. But it could be that Abaye is arguing on a previous generation. Abaye was a 4th century Amora, and Rabba was a 3rd century Amora. So there's every possibility that it is Rabba, though typically speaking, when we see Abaye and Rava, it is Rava who he's arguing with. Nevertheless, we'll read it as Rava. So this would be a question against Rava, because Rava said that's when a shlamim is brought. Seems to be that that's not when a shlamim is brought according to this price. So first long line answers the Gemara, lo. La'olam, really the Bryce is talking about shenimtza achar shchita v'himir bo achar shchita, and really it's talking about where the initially lost animal was found after the substitution. after its tmura was shechted as a korban pesach. Vikra asmachta be'almahu. And really the pasuk that's referenced in the Bryce of im keves is not meant to make a real drasha from. It's just an asmachta be'alma. An asmachta is a pasuk from which we don't learn a proper drasha. It's just meant to indicate something that we already know. It's kind of like, and while we're on the topic, we're going to use this pasuk as a raya, but it's technically speaking not the Mari Makom. So an asmachta often means that things are derabanan, and sometimes here it even means that it's not mukhrach at all. The pasuk is not the raya, and because that's the case, so the brisa is not really a kasha and rab anymore, because the brisa is only indicative of the fact that the pasuk is an asmachta, but not actually a drasha. So if that's true, says the Gemara, then what the real purpose of the pasuk of im kesef? Says the Gemara, second of the wide lines, elakra lemay asa. What is the pasuk actually being used for? That's a good question. If we know that it's only an asmachta and we don't technically need it, so then what was the pasuk actually used for? It wasn't coming to teach us our case of Rabbah. So answers the Gemara, elakra l'mayasa, kidetanya. The Brisa writes, kesev. When the pasuk says kesev, what do we learn from that one word without the word im? We'll get to the word im in a minute. The word kesev alone, l'rabos asa pesach la'aliyah, to remind us that when it comes to the korban pesach, that the tail has to be brought on the mizbeach, has to be consumed on the mizbeach. Kshehu omer im kesev. What does the extra word of im mean in this pasuk? Says the Gemara, l'rabos pesach she'avra shnaso, to include the following cases: a pesach that's older than a year, too old for a korban pesach, ushlamim haboyin machmas pesach, and a case of a shlamim that's brought due to a case of tmura where an animal was lost, that in those cases, l'chol mitzvah shlamim, that they have the regular halachos of a shlamim that apply to them. What are those regular halachos? Says the Gemara, sheton smicha, we're supposed to press down the weight of the bailim onto the animal. Unesachin, we use wine during that. Utnufa chazav v'shok, and we actually have the kohen move the animal, move the body parts of the chazeh, of the chest and the shok of the thigh. They're carried around. Ukshehu omer, what does the rest of the pasuk mean? The im is, says the Gemara, the Brisa here just kind of cuts a line and says, no, hifsik inyan. Now we're talking about something else. Limit ala she'ein tu'una aliyah. We're not talking about our animal anymore. We're not talking about a shlamim anymore. We're talking about an aiz, about a goat that, technically speaking, does not have the din of the aliyah, that the aliyah has to be burned, and that's what that Brisa means. So therefore, we started out with Rava trying to qualify the seifa of our Mishnah. We asked a question from Abaye. We gave an answer that left Rava's shita still valid, and that is all approach number one. And approach number two is going to take a similar Rava, the same person, but a modified version of what he said, and we're going to try it with the Resha. And that's what the Gemara is doing here. 6 lines from the bottom on Sadi Vav Mibay says the Gemara, Ika demasni lo aresha. Some say that this line of Rava in its qualification of our Mishnah was not on the Seifa, but was rather on the Resha. How so? If you have a korban pesach that was found before the korban pesach was brought, so you have animal A that was lost. Once you lost it, you had already dedicated animal A to be a korban pesach. So what can you do? So you get another animal. It's a tmura. It's the replacement animal. That's animal B. Animal B was about to be brought, and then they found animal A. So then what do we do here? We have Pesach shenimtza kodem shchitas Pesach. You find animal A before it's shechted. The halacha is yireh, that animal has to graze ad sheyistayv, until it has a mum of some kind and it becomes tameh. V'yimacher, and it needs to be sold. V'yavi bedam of shlamim v'chein tmuraso. And that animal needs to get its money compensated for. We sell that animal and we take the money and it's used to purchase a shlamim. V'chein tmuraso, that would be true also for animal B who was not yet shechted. So animals A and B become best friends and they graze their days out in the field until they are then sold for shlamim. And here, says approach number two, here is where we find Rava. Rava wasn't qualifying the seifa of our Mishnah. Rava was qualifying this din, that if animal A is found prior to animal B being shechted as the korban pesach, that they both go out to graze. On my Rava, 5 lines from the bottom of Tzadi Vav Midbeis, says the Gemara, my Rava lo shanu ela shenimtza kodem shchita v'himir bo kodem shchita. This is only true if the lost animal was found before shchita, and also the hamara, the tmura, was made prior to shchita. Aval, maybe we would have said in the name of Rava, aval nimtza kodem shchita v'himir bo achar shchita. If the hamara, if the tmura was made for an animal after the shchita took place, Tmuraso kreva shlamim. There we would say that there is a shlamim. Why would we make this distinction that in the Resha, where everything is, where the Hamara is done before and the Truma is done before, and that he would be Yira, the animal would graze. Yet if the Hamara, if the Tmura was done after the Shchita, that animal would be a shlamim. Says the Gemara, my taima, 3 lines from the bottom, ki kava shchita midi dechazile, midi de lo chazile lo kava. So by the Resha, by the first part of Rava, that's Yira ad she'istai. It's not chazile hakrava, because the animal was found and the Tmura was done prior to the korban being brought. At that point, you have to go get a proper animal to be brought as a korban. Mashein came, if it was already done after the shchita, so then we'd say that the animal can be brought as a shlamim. On this version number 2 of Rava, version number 1 of Rava made a qualification on the Seifa. Version 2, what we have now is a qualification on the Resha, and on that Abaye asks his question at the bottom of Tzadi Vav Amud Beis. Esve Abaye, Im Kesev, this brisa, the same brisa we just had. Im Kesev, what do we see from there? Matamud Lomar, what does the Torah teach us from those words? L'rabos tmuras haPesach achar haPesach shekreva shlamim, that this replacement animal can be brought as a shlamim. Turning to the top of Tzadi Zayin Amud Aleph, Yachol aflifnei haPesach came. Maybe it would be the case that if it was before Pesach, that the tmuras haPesach would be a shlamim. So it says the Gemara, Talmud Lomar, who, the Torah says the word who. What's the pasuk? The pasuk is V'amartem zebach Pesach hu laHashem. So from that word who, we learn the following: Hu karev ve'ein tmuras haPesach kreva. But the tmura, the replacement animal, will not get a korban shlamim. So it says the Gemara. This is Abaye's analysis of this brisa. Abaye asks, "Hey Chidami, what are the details of this brisa? If everything was found beforehand, that's the case of Yira ad she'istai. That's a case where we would absolutely say that the animal should graze, because the hakrava, the actual korban, wasn't brought yet. We know that this animal needs to graze, both of them, animal A and B. If that's true, lama likra, elalav, it must therefore be shenimtza kodem shchita. Yes, animal A was found kodem shchita, but bihimir bo achar shchita tiyuvta de Rava tiyuvta, and Abaye then rejects Rava's answer because it doesn't fit with the brisa and it's not fixable. So that's a very strong end to the Gemara. With version 1 of the Gemara, we were able to tolerate Rava's opinion as a qualification of the Seifa. Masha'en Kain, version 2 of the Gemara, is a rejection of Rava in his understanding of the Resha. When it comes to the methodology of Psak, these types of Gemaras are crucial. Historically speaking, it's sometimes very hard to paste together Gemaras. We know that Rava made a comment on a brisa. Rava was a 4th century Amora. We're talking well over 100 years after the canonization, approximately 100 years after the canonization of the Mishnayos. But if we don't know what part of the Mishnah Rava was talking about, how do we paskin halacha? So that's why we have Rishonim, and the Rishonim have to get into this sugya. When we have an Ika Damasni, do we follow the Ika Damasni? Do we assume the Resha? The first approach is right. Very, very difficult to be a posek, because you have to be able to look at these Gemaras and determine which version of Rava was correct. If version 1 is correct, fine. We can accept Rava's distinction as the Gemara does. But if version 2 of Rava is correct, then he's rejected, and we need to get a new tfisa, a whole new understanding of the Mishnayos. Makes the job of a posek very difficult to learn sugyas like this, because we just don't know which Rava was right. The Gemara is now going to pivot. We're 6-7 lines down, Tzadi Zayin Amud Aleph, and we're going to discuss a statement of Shmuel that, as we will soon see, isn't really as grandiose as it seems. Shmuel is going to make a comparison between the world of a Korban Chatas and the world of Pesach. He's going to state a general rule, and we'll question it a number of times in a number of ways and end up rejecting most of his comparison. But let's get started with his comparison. 6-7 lines down, Tzadi Zayin Amud Aleph, Amar Shmuel. Kol shebechatas mesa. A chatas mesa is a group of 5 different psulim of a korban chatas. In any of these cases, when you have a chatas mesa, that animal is a chatas mesa, so bepesach karev shlamim, that same psul by the chatas, the same psul that exists by a korban pesach, that animal would then be brought as a shlamim. V'chol shebechatas roeh, anywhere where a korban chatas would have the halachic result because of its problems and its impurities, it would then be left to graze for the rest of its life. The Pesach nami roeh. So if X then Y, and if Z then Z, what does that mean? If X then Y, if by Achatas the halacha is X, that it should be Mesa, then by Pesach Y it should be Roa. And if it's going to be that it's going to be Shlamim, excuse me. So it's either Mesa and Shlamim are the same Chatas to Pesach, or by Achatas where it says Roa, then by Pesach as well it would say Roa. And then Rav Yochanan argues on this, and again we'll have to see where these two shitas play out. It's Shmuel versus Rav Yochanan. Shmuel versus Rav Yochanan. We're going to get back to this shortly. Rav Yochanan Amar, no. Ein haPesach karev shlamim ela shenimtza achar shchita. He disagrees with Shmuel's comparison that the sweeping comment of everything that by achatas is a mesa is going to be shlamim by a korban pesach. Says Rav Yochanan, no. The only time that a korban pesach is bishlamim is when it's nimtza achar shchita, if it's found after the shchita. So it says aval kodem shchita lo, that had it been that the animal that was lost was found before shchita, the halacha is low, says Rav Yochanan, that it would not be a shlamim in those cases. So says the Gemara, Rav Yosef is like, wait a second. Wait, Shmuel, your comment is so broad that every single psul that exists by the Chatas Mesa, Rashi here indicates that a Chatas Mesa, if you take a look at the longer Dibur HaMaschil of Rashi, of Amar Shmuel, Rashi says there, Kol Shebechatas Mesa, Chamesh Chataos Mesos, Halacha L'Moshe Misinai. There are 5 of them that are in this category. So I don't want to limit our understanding here. There's a lot of possibilities as to what's wrong with these animals. We're not even going to get into that right now. But what really bothers Rav Yosef is the following. Maskif la Rav Yosef, quarter of the way down Tzadi Zayin, but Aleph, he says, Uklalahu, is this general rule so accurate? How can that be? V'harei, chatas she'avra shnasa, if you have a chatas that exceeded its age, it's too old to be brought as a korban pesach, the halacha is that it's brought as a roa. What did Shmuel say? That if a chatas is a roa, then a pesachim is a roa. So let's see. If you have a chatas that's a roa, Damar of Yochanan, Damar of Shimon ben Lakish, chatas shabra shnasa rono so kilu hi omedes beves hakvaros v'roa. There we have a statement explicitly from Rav Shimon ben Lakish that if you have a chatas that's a roa, that it has to graze. Fine. A chatas that is too old, it has to graze. But what about by Pesach? What we should have seen, according to Shmuel, is that they both should have the same din, because Shmuel said that if by a chatas it's roa, then by a Pesach it should also be roa. What do we see here? Ve'ilu bePesach ki agavna, doesn't say roa, karev shlamim. There we see it's brought as a korban shlamim. That's a stira to the sheet of Shmuel, because Shmuel said that if by chatas it's a roa, then by Pesach it's a roa. But that's not true. We see that if by chatas it's a roa, where Rav Shimon ben Lakish showed us a text proof that Taka, it's true that by achatas the animal that's too old would be a roa. However, v'ilu bePesach ki agavna karev shlamim. What's the Mari Makom that indicates that by Pesach, if an animal is too old, it should be a shlamim? Says the Gemara in a Brisa, Tanya, kesev l'rabos hetza Pesach le'aliyah. We saw this already, that a kesev, that what does the Torah mean when it says that? To include the animal's tail as part of the korban. What's relevant to us? Omer im kesef, from the word im in the Torah. What do we know? L'rabos es haPesach she'avra shenaso. And not only that, v'shlamim havoyin machmas Pesach l'chol mitzvah shlamim shetun and smicha u'nesachen u'tnufas chazev v'shok. So we saw this already, that we already have that this animal should be should be put in this category of a shlamim. And kshu omer, let's just finish out the brisa, though not relevant for our needs. Kshu omer im eis, when the pasuk says im kesef im eis, what does im eis mean? Hifsikayin limeid al ha'eis she'ein ta'un aliyah. That the tail of the eis of a goat should not be brought if it's going to be brought as a korban pesach. What do we see in this brisa? We see a big thorn in the side of Shmuel's shita. Shmuel was of the opinion that if a chatas is going to be told that it has to graze, so too by korban pesach. Yet that's not true, because we have a chatas that's told to graze per Reb Shimon ben Lakish. Yet the brisa indicates that in an equal case where the animal is told to graze because of its age, that it's brought as a shlamim, stira and Shmuel. That doesn't work. So answers the Gemara halfway down, a little bit more than halfway down on Tzadi Zayin Amud Aleph, says the Gemara, Amar le kiko Amar Shmuel. When did Shmuel say his rule that if the korban chatas has a din of roa that it has to graze, so too by a Pesach? That was only be'avudin, with animals that are lost, but be'dechuyin, with animals that are pushed off because of, in this particular example, the animal's too old. In that case, the din doesn't apply. Shmuel's din doesn't apply. We would not then say that just like by a chatas it's roa, so too by a Pesach it's roa. Instead, it would have different dinim. We would have said that by a chatas it's roa, exactly like Rav Shimon ben Lakish explained to us. But when it comes to the korban Pesach, because of its age, that's not the din. The din is that it would have to then be brought as a shlamim. Says the Gemara, your answer is not a good answer. You want to say that Shmuel's whole answer is only true. Shmuel's whole rule that he said at the top of the page, 6, 7 lines down, the rule that Shmuel said is that if the animal is roeh as a chatas, it should be roeh if it's a psachim. That only applies if an animal is lost, but not if it's nidche. Says the Gemara, ve'avud mi mishkachasla. What is your example, Shmuel? Give me the case example of your prototype of where something is lost. Says the Gemara, "V'harei avuda b'shas hafrasha lerabanan delarayil azla." If an animal is lost at the time that it was being nifrash as a korban pesach, it's not brought as a shlamim. It's brought as a. It's not brought at all. It's l'riyah according to the chachamim. We're going to learn this brisa, which shows the sheet of the chachamim, but the first sheet that's brought is not the chachamim. The first sheet is going to be Rebbe. Titnan, the Mishnah writes, this Mishnah is a Mishnah Maseches Tmura. Hifrish chataso ve'avda. If a person separates a korban chatas and it's lost, v'hifrish acheres tachteha, and you bring a replacement animal, v'nimtes harishona, and then animal A of the chatas is brought, v'areshtein omdos. Now we have both of them in front of us, but the chatas had yet to be brought. The halacha is achas men tikrav v'shnia tamus. One of them is shechted and the other is going to die. That's a sheet of Rebbe. No grazing according to him. Let's see what the sheet of the Chachamim is. Chachamim omrim, ein chatas mesa l'shenimtzes lachar shniskapru bailim. The only time a chatas mesa has a din of a chatas mesa, per the halach l'mosh misinai, is when it's found after the animals have gotten kapara. Kodem sheniskapru bailim roa. But in that case, we would see that the animals would be roa, that they would have to just graze. But in conflict, what would we see by Pesach? Hecha da'avad v'nimsa achar chatzos kodem shchita karev shlamim. So what would we do about that? That poses a big problem for Shmuel. You said that your rule applies only when things are avudin. Yet over here, Shmuel, it doesn't work. You just said we held like the Rabbanan. You don't even hold like the Rabbanan yourself, Shmuel, because you would hold yourself that in such a case it would be shlamim. So it says the Gemara, you're right. Shmuel doesn't hold like the Rabbanan. Answers the Gemara, 6 lines from the bottom. Shmuel kerebi svirale to amar avuda lemisa azla. That when it comes to an animal that's lost, it's lemisa. And therefore, we see that his rule doesn't apply here because it's not either of the possibilities of Shmuel. It's not roeh and it's not karev. The animal is left to die. Says the Gemara, but wait a minute. Is it true? Is it true that it's a backhanded understanding of Rebbe? It's not what he says, but it seems to then imply that Rebbe would have indicated that all the animals are mesa. That's not true. There is another case where he would have said that the animal should be roeh. Kodem chatzos lav avodu. But if you find something before chatzos, well, the threshold of time of saying that something is actually a korban pesach hasn't even hit yet. It's not even chatzos yet. So answers the Gemara, 3 lines from the bottom, Kid the Rava. This must be like the opinion of Rava. The Amar, I should say, continuing the question. Sorry, I apologize. Kodem chatzos lav avud. How do we know that kodem chatzos is not considered a time that is avud? It's not lost yet because you still have time to dedicate the correct animal. Why? Because how do we know that that's true? Kid the Rava. What does Rava say? The Amar Rava, avedas laila lav shma aveda. You can't say that your animal is lost until the time comes to shech the animal. Maybe it'll show up 5 minutes later. Sometimes when people have dogs, they leave their property for days. They always come back. They come back for whatever. They always come back for something. They're not usually lost forever. So the Gemara says within the name of Rava, that's not considered avud. If that's true, says the Gemara, then how then do we have a scenario where, according to Rebbe, an animal will end up grazing out its life instead of being put to death? Says the Gemara on the top of Tzadi Zayin and Beis, Kid the Rav Oshia. This is like the opinion of Rav Oshia. What does Rav Oshia say? In order to support, what are we trying to find? We're trying to find a scenario where Rebbe could be of the opinion that he has a case of roa. So Rav Oshia says on Tzadi Zayin and Beis, Damar Rav Oshia, Hifrish techatos la'achrayis. If a person takes out 2 korbanos chatos le'achrayis, 2 korbanos chatos le'achrayis means I'm taking one, and in case something happens to the one, I have a backup. That's what it means le'achrayis, that you're bringing 2 korbanos chatos. So the halacha is if you're hifrish chatos le'achrayis, miskaper ba'achas men v'shniya tira, that one of them good to go. It'll be your korban chatas and you get kapara, and the other one of them will be roa. And maybe this is where Rebbe gets it from, says the Gemara. But that's a problem too, because if Shmuel holds like Rebbe, and Rebbe says that this case is tira, and that this is going to be a case of roa. If Shmuel's halacha is going to follow Rebbe, then we're stuck again, because it should be that by achatas, if it's roeh, if the animal is going to graze, it should have been the same by psachim. But if Shmuel holds like Rebbe, then this doesn't work, because here Rebbe says it's tira, that it's going to be considered an animal that needs to graze. But then we would have expected by Korban Pesach that it also should have been to graze, but that's not the din. The din doesn't play out that way. It says here that it's a shlamim. So therefore, the Gemara pivots again for Shmuel's understanding. Ela Shmuel, what's the better way to understand Shmuel's line, where Shmuel says that if a chatas is going to be roa, that a korban pesach needs to be roa? Ela Shmuel ke Reb Shimon sfirale. Shmuel really holds like Reb Shimon. What does Reb Shimon hold? The Amar chamesh chatos mesos, that there are 5 animals that die. Says the Gemara, but haroa Reb Shimon, less like klal. Is it the case that Reb Shimon would be of the opinion that there is no case of roa? Shmuel nami chada ka'amar. So says the Gemara, we have to go back and re-understand Shmuel altogether. Really, Shmuel was only talking about one din in his comparison. When Shmuel made a comparison between the world of chatas and the world of psachim, it was to teach us one piece of information. Let's see what that is. Shmuel nami chada ka'amar. Kol shebechatas mesa bepesach karev shlamim. What did he mean when he said that the halacha l'moshe misinai bechatas mesa, of these 5 different types of problems that we can have with a korban chatas, that there's anything to learn about a korban pesach? Umay kamash malan, says the Gemara, it was just to make sure we didn't misunderstand Shmuel's understanding as it relates to Rav Yochanan. La'afu came to Rav Yochanan. To Amar, what does Rav Yochanan hold? Ein pesach karev shlamim el shenimtza achar shchita, that the korban pesach cannot be a shlamim unless it's after the shchita took place. Abal kodem shchita lo, but before the shchita, that's not true. What do we see from Rav Yochanan? Says the Gemara, Alma, what must Rav Yochanan hold that is the line in the sand to determine when we look at an animal differently, a korban pesach differently? It must be shchita kava, that he looks only at the time when the shchita actually takes place. Says the Gemara, Kamash Malan, what is Shmuel coming to teach us? Shmuel is coming to teach you one thing, not this whole grandiose comparison between Chatas and Pesachim. Only one thing. I don't agree with Rav Yochanan, says Shmuel. Shmuel thinks that Shchita is the Koveya, that the time that the Korban Pesach is actually karev, when the knife does its job of Rov Kana Veshet, when it actually shechs the animal, that's the line in the sense. Says Shmuel, absolutely not. Kamash Malan. Chatzos keva, that really kava, that the middle of the day, chatzos hayom, the time at which the korban pesach is at its earliest eligible time to bring the korban pesach. That is what we establish as the line in the sand, and not the shchita itself. It has to be chatzos. Lishnachrina, almost halfway down Tzadi Zayin Amud Beis. Lishnachrina, another possibility of how to understand this sugya. So we had seen a problem with the sheet of Shmuel. The question we had asked on the bottom of the previous summit, from which this is quoting, it says as follows: V'ilu bepesach hecha da'avad. When an animal's lost, v'nimtza achar chatzos, and it's found after chatzos, kodem shchita yikrav shlamim. But v'nimtza achar chatzos, it's found after chatzos, but kodem shchita. So let's say 12 o'clock was chatzos, and the shchita was supposed to be at 1, and you find this animal at 12:30. So it's achar chatzos, but kodem shchita yikrav shlamim. It should be brought as a korban shlamim, says the Gemara. So then Shmuel, how does Shmuel explain that? Shmuel must be kirabba svir le'damar shchita kava. It must be that Shmuel holds like Rabba that shchita is kava, that we look at the 1 o'clock time of when the animal's actually shechted. Totally different than our previous understanding. Says the Gemara, but wait a minute. When Rabbi Yochanan taught us against Shmuel, Yochanan was taught in conjunction with Shmuel Shita. When Yochanan taught us the following, Rabbi Yochanan taught us that Eina Pesach Karev Shlamim Ela Shenimtza Achar Shchita. Abal Kodem Shchita Lo Alma. What did we see? Shchita Kava. That Rav Yochanan holds that way. If that's true, that Rav Yochanan holds that Shchita is a line in the sand, Michlal, 2/3 of the way down, Tzadi Zayin Amud Beis, to Shmuel, Savar Chatzos Kava. It must then be that Shmuel doesn't hold that it's Shchita. Shmuel must hold that it's Chatzos, that it's the earliest eligible time to bring the Korban Pesach, which determines when we look at an animal differently from before and after that moment. It should be Chatzos. Ella, therefore it must be Shmuel, Kerebi Svirale, that really Shmuel must have held like the Shita of Rebbe, and not like the Shita of Rabba the Amora, but Rebbe the Tana. The Amar Avuda Lamisa Azla, that when an animal is lost and then found, the animal has to be put to death. As says the Gemara, but wait a minute. Kol Avuda and the Rebbe Mason, Rebbe holds that all of these animals are put to death. If Shmuel's din that we saw an Amud ago, an Amud and a half ago is correct, then we have a stira in Shmuel because he holds like Rebbe. Because it should be that if one animal is roa by a chatas, it's also roa by Pesachim, it should graze. Yet we see over here that it's not. That one is shlamim and one is mesa and one is roa. They're not the same. So says the Gemara, Kasavar, you're right. Really, this whole argument was not to make a full grand equivalence between the world of Chatas and the world of Pesach, but rather, Kasavar Kodem Chatzos Lav Abudhu, must be like we saw within the previous version of this Gemara, that anything Kodem Chatzos is not considered lost, because Kasavar Chatzos Kava, that we only look at the earliest eligible time of the Korban Pesach as our turning point between before and after Chatzos. That's when everything shifts, and that's the sheet of Shmuel. To summarize, briefly, because this was almost a blot of Gemara here in this one sugya of Rav Yochanan and Shmuel. Shmuel basically wanted to make this equivalence, that when it comes to 5 different types of Korbanos Chatas that have problems, that whatever the halacha is when they're roa, if the animal is sent out to graze, we would assume the same exact thing would be true by a Korban Pesach with those similar flaws. The Gemara says for 20 reasons, it just doesn't work. It doesn't fit all the Mari Makomos. So the Gemara therefore concludes, you're right. Shmuel's comparison to say that which happens by a chatas and the chatas is sent out to graze, therefore the same should be true by a korban pesach. All he was doing was contrasting with the sheet of Rav Yochanan to make sure that everybody knew that Shmuel was of the opinion that chatzos kava, that the middle of the day, the chatzos hayom and yud daled Nisan, that's the line in the sand when we begin to look at korbanos differently. Mashein Ken Rav Yochanan was of the opinion that shchita kava, and that brings us to our next Mishnah. And our final Mishnah from the day, we'll go from right here to the next Mishnah on Tzadi Ches Amud Aleph, and then we will call it a night. Says the next Mishnah, Mafrish nekeva lepischo. You're not allowed to do that. We don't use a female animal for the korban pesach, but a person who was mafresh nekeva, zachar ben shtei shanim, or a male animal, but a male animal that's ineligible because it's too old. So what halachic ramification? What if I took a different animal, a dog, an animal that's totally not relevant? So what happens to the kedusha that you try to impart to this animal that really is ineligible? A female animal or an animal that's 2 years old is ineligible for korban pesach. So the Gemara is going to debate what we learn from there. And the Mishnah indicates the Mishnah writes that if you set aside the nekeva lepischo or a zachar ben shnei shanim lepischo, that these animals have to graze until they have a mum, and then you sell, and then you take the money and you make a shlamim out of it. The Mishnah continues on the top of Tzadi Ches Amud Aleph, Amafresh Pischo Umeis, that one who sets aside a korban pesach and it dies, the Mishnah writes, Lo yivienu beno acharav l'shem pesach elo l'shem shlamim. His child, who would bring it after he dies, he should not bring it l'shem pesach. We'll see why in the Gemara. He's an onen. We'll see in the Gemara momentarily. He's not allowed to do that. Ella, he has to bring it not l'shem pesach, but l'shem shlam. So again, the second case of the Mishnah is if a person properly, not a female animal and not an animal that's too old, the perfect animal, but the Baal Habayis dies. So then if that happens, so then the halacha is that his son cannot bring that animal as a korban pesach. He has to bring it as a shlamim. Opens the Gemara, 2 lines from the top. We learn 3 things from our Mishnah. Number 1, these 2 animals are nidchin. They have a halachic status of no longer being able to be used for a korban. Why? They're completely ineligible for a korban pesach. It's like taking a cow. It's just totally ineligible. It needs to be a smaller animal. It needs to be male. It needs to be under a year old. These cases are ridiculous. It's in the cave. Everybody knows. It's like a pasuk and chumash. It's obvious that that's not allowed to be used. What does the Gemara teach you? That once you impart the kedusha, even though it makes no sense, of course, this animal is ineligible to be a korban pesach. But afal pikein, because you did set aside this animal, at least the animal's in the sugya of a korban pesach, afal pi, that is the wrong gender and the wrong age. So the Gemara says, Shma mina ba'alei chayim nidchen, that we do generate a status of dichui, where we push off this animal to say it can no longer be used as a korban, both in the keva and the animal that's too old, and now it has to be yira ad she'istayv, it has to graze until it generates a mum. Number 2, 4 lines down, Here as well, that from the very beginning, the second you say something about the animal, it's done. We don't have to wait until a particular zman, just done. The animal now has its status. And as well, even the money that we are going to gain from selling this animal once it has a mum, we halachically have control over it. And the damim, or at least the chachamim, gave over the status of that animal's funds to be a shlamim. Good. Next, hamafresh pischo, says the Gemara, hamafresh pischo, that's our case at the top of Tzadi Chesed Aleph, where a person set aside an animal properly for Pesach, the right kind of animal, and then he passed away. Tanu Rabbanon, we have a Tosefta right here in this parak in Pesachim, and the Tosefta writes as follows: hamafresh es pischo umeis. Let's say that Rahman al-Islam, a person passes away right after setting aside and choosing their korban Pesach. So the halacha is, im beno memuna imo, if the son is manui, if he is a part of the chabura for the korban Pesach, so yivienu l'shum Pesach. So says the Gemara that he should bring it as a korban Pesach. Okay, why? That kind of makes sense, because the father and son were on the same korban. Yes, the father was the memane, but it doesn't make a difference. He was mafresh. It doesn't really make a difference. At the end of the day, the son can bring it because they're both mechuyev on the same exact korban, and they're both manui on the same korban. What about ein beno memuna alav? Let's say his son was not part of his korban pesach, on this korban pesach that he set aside and the father died. Halacha is yivienu l'shum shlamim l'shisha asar, that he should bring it as a korban on the 16th of Nisan, namely on Chol HaMoed. L'yud vav, on the 16th. That's when he can bring it l'tesvav lo, but he cannot bring it on the 15th, which is the first day of Pesach. Why can he not bring it on the first day of Pesach? The Gemara teaches a side din, kasavar nedarmu nedavos and craven b'yom tov. Oh, you're just not allowed to bring it on Yom Tov. This type of animal that's going to be karev, because it's not a korban Pesach, it's a shlamim, and because it's a shlamim, you can't bring a korban nadava whenever you want. It cannot be brought on Shabbos and Yom Tov. So therefore, for the son who is not memane on this animal of the father. So again, the case is the father is mafresh an animal lepischo, and then the father dies. This child who's going to then bring the korban was not manui on the same korban. He can bring the animal, but he can't bring it as a Pesach. He has to bring it as a shlamim, and because he's bringing it as a shlamim, he can't bring it on the 15th because we're not karev shlamim on the 15th. It can only be on Chol HaMoed, which is the 16th. Says the Gemara, quarter of the way down, almost 2/3 of the way down, demis ha'av emas. Says the Gemara, when did the father exactly die? Not to be non-emotional about this, but there are some halachic implications as to when he dies. For example, ilema demis kodem chatzos. If you want to say that the son, that the father died right before chatzos, then that's a big problem. Beno memuna imo yivienu l'shum pesach. Even if his son is memuna on the same korban pesach, even if he is, so what? It's not yet the zman for the chiyuv. This person is an onein, and he is pater from all mitzvos aseh shel Torah. There's a machlokas in the Rishonim, is an onein. When we say that an onein is pater from mitzvos, does that mean he's allowed to do the mitzvah if he wants, but he's pater? Or no, we say he's not allowed to do. That's machlokas, I believe, between the Tosfos and Rambam. I have to look that up in my notes from a while back. But nevertheless, there is a machlokas Rishonim there, and we're pretty machmir. If a person, when we sat shiva, when a person, so I put on tefillin on one particular day, and then a family member passes away. The next morning, before the burial, no tefillin. Even after the burial, no tefillin. You're mamish pater. You're totally pater. So this person, it's a mitzvah saseh shel Torah. How are you an onin? How are you doing this? It doesn't even make any sense. So it says the Gemara, must be ala demis achar chatzos. It must be that he died after chatzos hayom. And if he died after chatzos, then ein beno memuna imo yivienu l'shum shlamim. Then the son that was not memuna, he should have brought a shlamim. Says the Gemara, hakabeise hakavate chatzos. But I don't understand. When chatzos hit, it was already a korban pesach, because the father died after chatzos, so that doesn't make sense either. So Amar Rav, the Gemara is going to give a whole host of answers to this question, and then we will wrap up for the night. So says the Gemara as follows. Amar Rava, answer number one, La'olam demis kodem chatzos. Really, the father did die beforehand. U'mayi vienu l'shum pesach sheni, a gevaldik answer. When it says that he's supposed to bring another korban, it doesn't mean this year. It means it doesn't mean that on Yudal Nisan it's for Pesach Sheni. He should bring it after he's no longer an onin by Pesach Sheni and Yudal Iyar. Another answer says the Gemara, in the name of Abaye. Abayam are halfway down. Tzadiches Meralef Amar Abaye. Litzadim Ktani. I want to tell you about two parts of the possible answers. Meis Achar Chatzos. If he dies after Chatzos, then the son who is part of the Korban Pesach, he can bring in the animal. That's not a problem because it's because the Gemara says here that it's after Chatzos. So then it's no longer a problem of aninus, and the problem doesn't arise. But kodem chatzos ein b'no mamune moivi enu l'shum shlamim. The other son can bring it not as a korban pesach, but as a shlamim. That's not a mitzvah d'oraisa. Rav Shiravia Amar La'olam Demis La'achar Chatzos. Really, the father did die after Chatzos, but Uchigon Shahya Aviv Goses Bechatzos. A Goses in halacha is a person who is imminently going to die, but not yet. And therefore, in that case, even though he was Mafresh Lepischo in our Mishnah, the Mafresh Lepischo is not a full Mafresh Lepischo because he could have died at any moment, and we don't consider the Hafrasha to be authentic. Rav Ashi Amar La'olam Demis La'achar Chatzos. Really, it was that the person died after Chatzos. Rav Shimon Damar in Baalei Chaim Nidachen, and he disagrees with our presumptions that we started with in our Gemara in the name of Rav Huna B'Rei Rav Yoshua, who holds Ein Ba'alei Chaim Nidchen, that really the animal is not nidche. We don't push it off entirely. We're allowed to bring it later if the animal is still viable. We don't automatically determine the status of the animal right now. We wait. Maybe the status can change to a shlamim. We'll see. And then the last answer is Ravina. Ravina Amar Kigon Shefrishu Achar Chatzos. Really, the father wasn't even mafresh until after Chatzos to set aside the animal for the Korban Pesach. Umeisu Ba'alam Achar Chatzos v'Kosavar Chatzos Kava. And because the animal was nifrash after Chatzos, and Chatzos was the zman of kvilus, you're already past that time already. So there as well, the halachos would be different than we would have thought initially. We're going to stop right here. Mir Hashem will pick up tomorrow night with a blot and a half of Sadi Ches Beis and Sadi Tes. And as you can see on Sadi Tes, we will in Mir Hashem be finishing this parak and entering into a very, very gishmak parak of Arvei Pesachim, a very well-known parak, ones that are learned in a lot of high schools over the years. So very much looking forward to that parak, a very halacha l'maisa in many cases as well. Wishing you all a beautiful night and a Shavua Tov. Thank you so much for joining.